Okay. Okay. All right. Here. Yeah. Yeah. You have it? Have an extra. You guys want all of those, or do you want you guys want one of these?
Yeah, I'll take one of these.
Yes, I'll take one of those too.
Yes. Oh, Tarmac. I'll take Tarmac.
You want Tarmac?
Yes.
Another Tarmac?
Yes.
Here, this is a Tarmac. I'll take a Tarmac.
We want all Termacs, actually.
Tarmacs.
It's not partisan.
Thank you for all the work you're doing. Okay. Yeah, of course.
How are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Thank you. I'm good, thank you. Yourself? Good. Well, thank you. Very nice to meet you. Does this look crazy? I can't see it.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. Thank you. Great turnout. Yeah, this is great. And a great issue that's growing in popularity. Yeah. Keep pushing. Thank you for leading, as always, on this stuff. Well, thank you.
Well, what a beautiful day, huh?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
So, is it... when... Give me the go. All right. Okay. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Congressman Hank Johnson. I'm happy to be here with you today. Thank you all for turning out. I'm glad that the weather is cooperating. We are gentlemen of laws, and the strength of our democracy lies in the people's respect for the rule of law as administered by a court system. The framers of our Constitution vested the judicial power of the United States in one Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court or command an army or maintain a police force. Instead, the Supreme Court derives its power from the trust and confidence of the American people. Today, we watch with alarm as public trust in our Supreme Court crumbles to the ground. A majority of Americans had an favorable view of the Supreme Court for the first time since the Pew Research Center began its polling. And it's no wonder, as we see a court that is no longer fair, impartial, or ethical. 6 of the 9 serving on the Supreme Court were put there by Leonard Leo's billion-dollar dark money network called the Federalist Society. That secret dark money network has an agenda which is, without a doubt, to make America great again. And we all know what it means. It means reshaping this country by reversing law and overturning abortion, voting rights, affirmative action, and more. In carrying forward the ideological agenda of the Federalist Society and other right-wing extremist interests, the touch with the American people. With 6 relatively young, extreme right-wing Supreme Court justices on the court with lifetime tenure, we're looking at the distinct possibility of this current group of justices being in place over the next 20 years. Liberty and freedom for some Americans. Our system is broken, and Congress act if we are to save liberty, freedom, and democracy for all. This year I've introduced several judicial reforms, including the Judiciary Act to expand the court and the Supreme Court Ethics, Recusal, and Transparency Act. And today I'm introducing, and I'm proud to introduce, another part of the court reform package. It's the Term Act, the Supreme Court Tenure Establishment and Retirement Modernization Act of 2023. The term limits Supreme Court justices to 18-year terms in active service, and it would regularize appointments so that new justices are appointed in the first and third years after every presidential election. The Term Act is necessary because lifetime tenure on the United States Supreme Court to a court that is insulated from and unaccountable to the American people, which is bad for democracy. How else can we explain the fact that the current Supreme Court is so arrogant, pompous, unaccountable, and out of touch that it feels like it can get away with refusing code of conduct and ethical standards that apply to all other judges? Term limits for Supreme Court justices is a reform that is wildly popular. 2/3 of Americans support term limits. And we have a wonderful coalition of groups out here supporting the Term Act. And I want to thank Stand Up America, Center for Popular United, People for the American Way, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, March for Our Lives, Term the Courts, and all other groups that are here today. 18-year term limits and regularized nominations would ensure a Supreme Court that is more representative of the nation. Term limits can help protect our rights, restore our faith in the judicial branch, and save our democracy. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I now want to pass it off to my friend, the representative from New York and esteemed Dan Goldman.
Thank you very much, Congressman Johnson, and thank you for leading on these issues as you do so well and so powerfully. There have been decades now of repeated ethical lapses that have underscored the vital need for Supreme Court reform. The Supreme Court is facing a crisis of legitimacy, public trust is eroding, and those of us who believe in our democratic institutions and a system of checks and balances must do whatever we can to restore confidence in the Supreme Court. We're also seeing and witnessing over the last several years an increasing politicization of the court, as the nominees are becoming more and more extreme and more partisan, and some are even lying during their Judiciary Committee hearings in order to get approved and appointed. This has led to some shocking decisions, not only because of the result of the decision, such as the rollback of the constitutional right for women to control their own bodies, which was the first time in history a constitutional right was eliminated by the Supreme Court, but also because of the for precedent. And that is what maintains the Supreme Court's continuity and legitimacy. And when we have justices who ignore settled precedent for their own political views and inflict their own political views on Americans, then we have a problem. There's also a race to the bottom. Presidents are increasingly nominating younger and younger justices with less experience so that they can stay on the court for 40 years or more. This Supreme Court Term Act, led by Congressman Johnson, make the Supreme Court more responsive to generational changes, incentivize better qualified judges and justices because more experienced candidates would be nominated. It ensures that every presidential term has 2 appointments, making the overall composition less partisan. And it is essential constitutional balance to the 3 branches of federal government. I've been proud to work with Congressman Johnson on other Supreme Court reforms that are essential as well to restoring confidence and legitimacy in the Supreme Court, including ethics reform. The revelation year of the dramatic ethical, and I use violations because they are not merely lapses. They were intentional violations, knowing and intentional. The Senate is moving forward with Congressman Johnson's CERT Act, which is an important step. On the side, I've led 18 other former prosecutors and law enforcement officers in calling on Chief Justice Roberts to implement an independent investigative body within the court to investigate potential violations of ethics and disclosure laws, as well as a designated ethics council. If Chief Justice can police itself, then show us how the court can police itself. And as a former federal prosecutor, the only way to police yourself is an independent investigation. The revelation that we have heard recently of the lapses continues to damage the legitimacy of the court. The status quo is unacceptable, and it will only serve to continue to undermine the faith in the institution. And that's why this bill is so popular and so important, because it will increase the confidence that of the Supreme Court justices are not for sale, nor is the court itself tied to one political party or another. We will continue to work on these reforms, and we will continue to push for the checks and balances that our Constitution requires to make sure that our democratic institutions, including the Supreme Court, maintain. Thank you all for being here, and I thank all the groups who support us on these very important issues of democracy and the rule of law for being here and supporting this bill. And I now
and I'm so proud to partner with him here and support his legislation. I have, and we all have seen the partisanship in the Supreme Court. We have all the ethical violations that have been seen. People's trust and faith in our Supreme Court has eroded substantially. Point that is coming from the Supreme Court. I think the Term Act will make a dramatic difference in protecting our democracy. We are the only major allows justices lifetime. We are one of the only democracies that have such a politicized political appointments, and we have seen that divide. And it is important that we establish trust among American people to be able to trust their Supreme Court for fairness and upholding our constitutional values. And this way in ensuring a balance that ethical standards will be adhered to, and we have a court, a Supreme Court that we all can be proud of and would be something we can ensure our democracy is supported, is proud of our Supreme Court and our justice system. So I am proud to stand here and be a co-sponsor of this important legislation by Congressman Johnson. And I am now have the privilege to introduce Executive Director of Stand Up America. Find organizations upholding democracy, supporting a fairer, better Supreme Court and a justice system. So I ask Christina Harvey, the Executive Director of Stand Up America. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. And thank you, Representative Johnson, for reintroducing this legislation and having us here today. As the Congressman said, I'm Christina Harvey, Executive Director of Stand Up America, and I'm here today on behalf of our nearly million members who are standing up every day across the country for a democracy that includes a corruption-free Supreme Court that will protect our right to vote and stand up for our fundamental freedoms. Representative Johnson has been a staunch advocate of reigning in a court that has strayed far from those. As you can see, we are a broad coalition here made up of voting rights activists, of advocates against gun violence, of warriors in the fight against income inequality. We are a broad coalition because the decisions of this court impact every issue and every American. A right-wing supermajority in control of this court, decisions that make it harder to protect our children from gun violence, harder for Americans to vote, harder to protect the planet that we depend upon for survival, and harder for us to access health care that we need. And to make those same Supreme Court justices of the supermajority making those decisions cannot seem to keep their hands out of the cookie jar. As if it weren't hubris enough that they have taken away our right to control our own. They have taken away the ability of the federal government to protect against racist voter discrimination laws. Every other week we wake up and we see another scandal. Another scandal involving especially Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. Millions of dollars spent on luxury vacations paid for mega donors. Tuition paid for family members of these justices by those same donors. And sweetheart property deals that would make the property brothers blush. It seems that after decades on the bench, these justices have been comfortable with just how much it takes of a sitting Supreme Court justice. That is perhaps why other democracies have already figured out that it makes no sense to give someone in a position of so much power a lifetime appointment. No other major democracy gives lifetime appointments to judges on their highest courts. And in fact, those that used to, like Australia and Canada and the United Kingdom, have long since abandoned this practice. Even the states have gotten the message. 49 out of 50 states in the United States either have maximum age cutoffs for their highest justices or term limits. Justices Thomas and Alito would be the first to go if the term limits were implemented. Was I supposed to say that? Let me say it again. Was I supposed to say that? They would be the first to go if term limits are implemented. If our most senior justices can't keep their hands out of the cookie jar, it's time for us to get them out of the kitchen. Under the Term Act, current justices are slowly term limited off the Supreme Court bench. Each president would have the opportunity to appoint 2 new justices during each of their elected presidential terms. Over time, this would mean that the balance of the court would better reflect the will of the American people as expressed through presidential elections, rather than depend upon partisan political gamesmanship, strategic retirements, and luck. Term limits are an integral part of Supreme Court reform, along with court expansion and investigating the ethical breaches of current Supreme Court justices. Over the past 3 years, our members have called and emailed their representatives nearly 600,000 times in support of Supreme Court reform. Y'all are going to have to get more staff, because we will keep calling and writing and showing up in Washington and at the ballot box until we have a corruption-free Supreme Court that will finally protect the rights of every American. Now, we're lucky, because as you can see, fortunately, we are not in this alone. So next, I would like to call the co-executive director of Center for Popular Democracy, where they are professional makers of good trouble. Thank you.
That's me. How you doing? It's good to see you. How you all doing?
Hey.
Good. I'm glad to be here. I'm the co-executive director. I'm really happy to be here for this particular event. I actually brought my son missing today from school so we could be here for this historical moment.
Yeah.
But as policy activists and journalists, we all know that we have to speak to the hidden giant elephant in the room, which is that we claim and pretend as if the Supreme Court is an objective and non-political of our tri-party government, right? We pretend that. The truth is that objectivity is not a real thing, and that who is sitting on the bench here makes a very large difference around who becomes and what type of world we live in. The Supreme Court has become an unaccountable part of the Republican Party at this point. We've seen it through a set of legislations that they've passed over. We've seen it through banning abortion and LGBTQ rights. We've seen it through universities not being allowed to have affirmative action, or people like me not being able to access affirmative action for future generations. We've seen it with Americans being blocked from having their student debt relief. And we've seen it, most importantly, in the weakening of our laws that protect the most holy and sacred part of our democracy, which is voting. And we've seen voting discrimination, keeping people like my family from being able to access the right to vote. I come from a family that had a patriarch that was killed while trying to go vote in 1925. And at that time, the Supreme Court was a different Supreme Court. It had come off the end of a different radical Supreme Court that in the late 1890s had shifted all the things that were won through the Reconstruction that allowed access to the rights and freedoms of citizens of the United States. Court got in office and reversed those things and made it so that it was hard for people who look like me and live in communities where I come from to access our fundamental rights as human beings on this planet. The Term Act was the thing that needed to happen. And we appreciate Congressman Johnson for having the foresight and carrying on the tradition of activists who come from the area that he come from and causing good trouble. We need that right now. We need leaders like him right now. Today, we sit in a place where we know that most of the Americans in this country, that our Supreme Court have lifetime appointments. Someone's personality over a lifetime could change. The society they live in changes. Their ability to make rules that make sense for our current democracy, our current society, they fail as you get older. The more distance you come from popular community and social actions, the less likely you are to make decisions that impact the society in a way that the community wants it to be impacted. At the Center for Popular Democracy, we are committed to regular people actually having power in our government. to regular people who get up and have to decide what they're going to do with their budget to have influence that govern our lives. We cannot continue to have people decide what happens in our lives who have never bought a carton of milk, who have never had to decide, can I get my kids to school and get to work on this same gas that I have in the tank of gas that I have in my car. We have to who are directly impacted making decisions. It is a time now for us to expand the court in order for us to make sure that we have equity, in order for us to make sure that our communities still support and believe in our democracy. We are at a crossroads right now. I do believe we're in a post-Reconstruction moment. I do believe that the last one we were in had a radical court that changed the laws and created a society that Martin Luther King and other activists had to fight to change and create the world where we currently live. And since that moment, there's been forces that have also been trying to bring back or make something again. And at this time, we have a choice we have to make. And it's the same choice that people had to make in history, but it's our choice now. And so I ask you, and I ask everybody, and CBD is asking, because we're calling the question, you got to decide what side you're going to be on. The question is, if you knew that your actions would change what happened in 1976, in the last rulings or the slaughterhouse rulings, if you knew your actions could change that, what would you do? Because whatever you would do then is what you need to do now. Thank you. Oh, and my job actually is to bring up, oh wait, who am I supposed to? Let's see. It's funny. My job is to bring up Svante Myrick, who is the ED of the People for the American Way.
Or I was hoping I wouldn't have to follow him. My name is Svante Myrick. I'm president of People for the American Way. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here to support Congressman Johnson, Congressman Thanedar, and Congressman Goldman as they reintroduce the Term Act. People for the American Way, if you don't know, for 40 years we have fought for an America where everybody enjoys the right to vote and have a vote that counts. And so we're here today because I want to say one thing about why we're here today. A couple of people have mentioned that the Term Act and term limits for Supreme Court justices are overwhelmingly popular with Americans. But one of the reasons people say they don't support term limits is because they think having experienced judges is a good thing. Well, I hope, particularly members of the press here, could help will actually lead to better and more experienced Supreme Court judges. This is not an ageist piece of legislation. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I would not be here, by the way. Our founder, People for the American Way, Norman Lear, founded it 43 years ago. He is still the most active member of our board. He's 101 years old. He's considering voting for Joe Biden, but he's concerned about his youth and inexperience. This is what we're talking about here, right? We are pro-experience. You probably have noticed, it's no secret, that each president is now appointing people younger and younger to the Supreme Court. Why? Because they're hoping that they can place somebody on the court that will be there for 40 and 50 years. I mean, we are just a couple terms away from the president of the Harvard Law Review, second year at Harvard Law School, right? We need to, with the Term Act, the incentive will instead be to appoint seasoned jurists, those who've been through the ringer, those who have proven their bona fides at lower courts, people who can gain and keep the trust of the American public. Because, newsflash, this court has lost it. The Roberts Court has lost it. And they've not done it because of the media, because of politics. They've done it to themselves. The individual actions of Supreme Court justices, like Clarence Thomas, accepting lavish gifts and trips and private jets and yachts and on and on and on, without disclosing it, has done it, but it's beyond that. The behavior of any one justice. It's in the opinions that this court has handed down. This court, which is supposed to be above politics, has made it possible for the Republican Party to surgically target and disenfranchise black voters and working class voters by closing polling places, shortening, and allowing for the type of gerrymandering that, frankly, would make the Dixiecrats blush. They've done it to themselves. They've eroded their credibility. What Congressman Johnson and his colleagues have done is give the Supreme Court a path back to legitimacy, a way to represent the American people. And don't fool yourself. The Supreme Court is supposed to be above the American people. It's never supposed to not be part of our representative republic. If it were, then they would appoint their own members. But the American Bar Association would appoint their members. No, they are appointed by presidents. They are confirmed by Senate for a reason. There is supposed to be a through line between and who sits on the court. But now that through line is fumbled and muddled by dumb chance. One president with a 4-year term could appoint 4 members of the Supreme Court, while another with 8 years in office could appoint none, based simply on who happens to live the longest. It's a silly system. It doesn't make sense anymore. And if we don't restore the faith of this court, it will leave us barreling towards a constitutional crisis. When they issue an opinion, an unpopular court issues an opinion, that a popular executive decides not to follow, what happens then? Well, I hope we never have to find out. That's why People for the American Way is here to support the Term Act, and we hope that you will join us in supporting Congressman Johnson, Thanedar, and Goldman's push to make this act a reality. It's my pleasure to introduce a real champion in this fight. It's Tiffany Miller from, please, join us, and Citizens United, who has been a champion on this and so many other issues. Thank you. And then you put some no on.
Yeah.
Okay.
We got a little back. Everyone, thank you so much, Savante. Thank you, Congressman Johnson. Incredible piece of legislation that is needed to reform and restore trust in the Supreme Court. I am Tiffany Muller. I am president of Citizens United, and it is a real honor to be here with all of you today and to be here with so many organizations doing the work to restore trust and faith in our democracy. But you know what? It's also a real shame that we have to be here at all, because we know that dark money has captured our Supreme Court to where they are doing the bidding of the special interest at the expense of the American people. And you know what else we've seen? That's not by chance. That didn't just happen. No. As a matter of fact, what we've seen come out in just the past 2 weeks is that Leonard Leo and Ginny Thomas were planning this dark money network from before the Citizens United ruling. That they actually were colluding about how to set this up. Set up the very system that then allowed them to spend $500 million to install an extremist far-right majority on the court, right? So they've been undermining our democracy, infringing on our freedoms, and taking away our rights for over a decade. And the American people have taken note. Confidence in the Supreme Court has plummeted, right? First time we have more Americans saying they don't have faith and trust in the Supreme Court than they do. And at the same time, the American majority are crying out for reform. They're crying out for legislation like the Term Act to actually restore confidence in the Supreme Court. Over 80% of Americans want the Supreme Court reformed. And of course they do. Because right now, the Supreme Court is answering to the billionaires and the special interest and pushing their extreme agenda over protecting the rights of the American people. So we at Citizens United with our 4 million members are proud to be in this fight. We are proud to be here with all of you today. Again, a big thank you to Congressman Johnson for continuing to push forward the fight for reform for the Supreme Court. And we know that it will help restore faith and trust in the American judicial system. And with that, I'm proud to introduce my good friend Noah Bookbinder from the crew, who is doing incredible work in this.
Thanks so much. I'm Noah Bookbinder, president of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. It's really terrific to be here with Congressman Johnson, who has been a leader in working to curb corruption in Washington for years and is leading again today. Leaders like Congressman Goldman and Congressman Thanedar, and with other strong, with also so many of my colleagues who are pushing every day to preserve our democracy. I'm thrilled to join them today in endorsing the Term Act, an essential reform to ensure that we can have confidence, once again, in our Supreme Court and in our democracy. The Supreme Court is and needs to be a crucial pillar of our system of checks and balances. It can be the last line of defense for protecting our democracy when there is executive overreach, which is something we've seen in recent years and could well see again. And that's why and legitimacy is so important. Unfortunately, right now the Supreme Court, as we've heard so much today, has a crisis of legitimacy with lower public regard than ever before. So there are two main reasons for this sorry state of affairs. First of all, political gamesmanship has resulted in an ideological Supreme Court that does not reflect the American people. And that leads to decisions, like the decisions we've seen in the past couple of years, that the people don't see as legitimate. Second, the Supreme Court is facing an ethics crisis that comes with reports of justices across the ideological spectrum owning stock in before them. It comes with reports of one justice repeatedly accepting lavish gifts, not just from wealthy benefactors, but from wealthy benefactors with an interest in exactly what the court does and how it comports itself. With a troubling lack of accountability. Almost every workplace in America has a code of conduct for its employees, except for the Supreme Court of the United States. That's unacceptable. The Term Act would address both of these problems. By instituting term limits and a regular schedule of appointments, the partisan gamesmanship would drop out, and the court would no longer be ideologically skewed and totally out of touch with the American people. Term limits would also reduce infallibility and distance from the American people, which will lead to greater accountability and fewer ethics problems. The presence of senior justices who can step in on given cases will make it easier for justices to step aside from cases where they have real or apparent conflicts of interest. That will lead to a more ethical court and greater confidence in the justices. This bill does all of that within a framework that is fair, constitutional, and supported by liberal and conservative legal scholars. We need a court we can believe in to safeguard our democracy. The Term Act is a crucial step in that direction. I now turn to our friend and colleague Ari at March for Our Lives.
Thank you so much, Noah. That was great. Hello, everyone. My name is Ari, and I'm with March for Our Lives. I am also a student, and I'm completing my senior year at Georgia. Hoya Saxa. In school, our generation was taught that America is a country run by and for the people. So many of us were lectured about the meaning of democracy and representation, and we were told that our government would listen to our collective voices. Civics class was though. In fact, it was a little different for everyone in my generation. Discussions of democratic values and checks and balances, we had to practice hiding in corners in the case of an active shooter. We would be able to vote, but only if we lived long enough to turn 18. Some of us survived, but some of us didn't, shot to death in their schools or on the streets in their own neighborhoods. And in their generation demanded change. Young people are mobilizing at unprecedented levels to demand our right to safety from gun violence, our right to a life with access to a safe and healthy education, liberty from the threat of being gunned down in our communities, and the pursuit of happiness in a country that prioritizes our lives over money from the gun lobby. Since its founding just 5 years ago, March for Our Lives has brought about earth-shattering change. Just last year, we turned out across more than 400 cities in marches demanding gun reform, including thousands who marched right here in Washington, D.C. And just a day later, the first major gun law in almost 30 years was introduced. But less than a month later, the Supreme Court's decision in NYSRPA versus Bruin callously rolled back our ability to protect ourselves from the gun violence that we have seen tearing apart our communities. Because of the Bruin decision, we have seen a systematic dismantling of laws that have lives, allowed us to walk in gun-free zones, live free from the fear of a concealed weapon, and have prevented domestic abusers from arming themselves. The Supreme Court is able to hand down dangerous and indefensible decisions like Bruin because there is no accountability. No accountability for when they take free vacations paid for by dark money groups. No accountability for when their nominations get slammed through the same Senate that slow walks Democratic nominees. And no accountability for when they make nonsensical and ahistorical decisions to put all of our lives at risk in the name of phony originalism. What we're talking about is gun violence, and it is not alarmist to say this court has overturned precedent upon precedent and is responsible for entirely changing the Second Amendment. Through these unprecedented and legally dubious decisions, the court is increasingly becoming an illegitimate institution in the eyes of young people, with nearly 70% of young people disapproving of the court. That our schools love to promise when 5 unelected judges paid for by conservative megadonors and the NRA get to steamroll our ability to advocate for laws that will literally save our lives. Our government is neither representative nor balanced when these corrupt actors have lifetime appointments to reverse the progress we've worked so hard for. The Term Act will bring so desperately need to our Supreme Court. When we pass this, far-right judges will no longer be able to wreak havoc on our democratic processes for the rest of our lives. No judge will be able to hold their seat for longer than some of us get to live. My generation has put in the work, and we're going to see this bill through its passage in the House because we can't afford not to. Any member of Congress doesn't have the courage to protect their constituents, my generation will show them the door this election cycle, as we have done time and time again. March for Our Lives and all of Gen Z is determined to live to see a world where our democratic achievements are safeguarded, where we protect our democracy, where it protects us. Young people deserve a judicial system that represents us, understands us, and will fight for us. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Alan Cohn of Term the Courts.
Congressman, thank you very much for having us here today. We stand in the shadow of what has been a institution that derives its authority from our shared faith in its fairness. You know, the idea of lifelong terms was to put justices on the Supreme Court immune from politics and pressure. But it's also made them, as we have talked about today, in some cases detached, removed, taking rights away previous judges recognized, kicking precedent to the curb, reversing a half-century of law protecting a woman's right to make her own health care decisions. Some members of this court are so secure in their certainty that they are untouchable that they see no problem with taking free trips and sweetheart deals from billionaires, in some cases, who have business in front of this court. It is obvious the vast majority of Americans no longer trust this court. Public approval for the Supreme Court is at an all-time low. Just 30% of Americans have confidence in this court, and nearly 70% of Americans believe that this court is primarily motivated by politics as opposed to following the rule of law. You know, it was Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall who said sometimes history takes things into its own hands. What we seek is a remedy to the problem that justices have created for themselves. This bill will make the court reflective of America. It ensures that every president elected by the people has the opportunity to nominate justices to the court. There is strong bipartisan support for the Supreme Court term limits. A recent poll showed 67% of the public wants it, of Democrats and 57% of Republicans. Chief Justice John Roberts says he supports term limits for the court, and so has Ted Cruz. Congressman, we are here today to support your effort and to announce a new national effort to help make that happen. Term limit the court. Wherever you see wrong or inequality or justice, speak out, because this is your country, Justice Marshall said. This is your democracy. Make it, protect it, and pass it on. And Congressman, that's exactly what we intend to do here today. I would like to give it back to you, Congressman, and thank you again for having me.
We'll take a few questions. Yes, ma'am. Well, because it feels like it. There's nobody to make them do it. They feel like it's not broke. They can handle their business, just quietly amongst themselves, with each justice being the judge and jury of his or her ethical conduct, and with the other justices taking a back seat. Things go, because they themselves don't want to be held accountable. So it's a good old boy kind of network that's comfortable being immune from accountability, and so arrogant that they think that the American people don't realize what they actually see. Is a billionaire having pocket, bought and paid for, over not just a year or two, but several decades. And so with that kind of thinking, and with lifetime tenure, I mean, they dare anybody to do anything about it. So, I'd love for the court to save itself from itself and determine that it needs to apply a code of conduct to itself, just as every other federal judge and even state judges are required to abide by. I would hope that they would have done it up to this point, and I don't know what would happen to cause. Yes, ma'am. Yes, I would love to work with anybody, regardless of party, who is willing to step up, admit to themselves and to the public that the time is here for court reform, for democracy reform, actually. We can't have a thriving democracy with a co-equal branch of government that has morally decayed and collapsed on itself. Our democracy can't survive that. It's based on the rule of law, and the Supreme Court is the ultimate decision maker in terms of what is the law. And so, yes, ma'am. Yes, we are working with Senator Whitehouse, who is coming forward with legislation on this same issue. And we look forward to working with the Senate, with whatever iteration of the Term Act they come up with, to see if we can reach an accord and get it passed and get it signed into law. Thank you. All right, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you so
All right,
much.
appreciate it.
Thank you. How are you?
Okay. All right, yes, sir. All right, thank you. All right.
Thank you for having me,
All right,
Congressman.
thank
Nice
you.
to see you.
Thank you. Tell my friend I sent
I
you.
was going to, thanks, Congressman.
All right, thank you.
All
camera here. I'll do.
Okay. So why don't we do this? Who's taking a picture?
I'll do this real quick. Oh, my hair. Oh, man. All right.
Nice to meet you, Charlotte. My name is.
Well, with that hair, but we're doing good things. Thanks, Congressman. Do you want me to get a photo of y'all?
Okay.
Congressman, I'm a housing commissioner at Danica, and I've been just appointed to the housing board in New Jersey, and I 100% I'm in agreement.
All right. Thank you.